No aircraft carries the weight of memory quite like the F6F Hellcat. For many Americans who lived through the Second World War, the name alone brings back images of carrier decks trembling under the roar of engines, of young pilots barely out of their teens climbing into cockpits with uncertain hands, and of a nation that refused to bow when the Pacific seemed lost. The Hellcat was not sleek or glamorous. It was not built to dazzle. It was built to endure. At a time when Japan's Zero reigned supreme, cutting through Allied squadrons with alarming ease, the United States Navy desperately needed an answer. What emerged was a rugged, dependable fighter that could take punishment, strike hard, and bring its pilots home. It was the kind of machine that a young man's parents could pray over, knowing it offered their son a fighting chance to return. By the end of the war, the Hellcat had become far more than a piece of steel and rivets. It was the workhorse that turned despair into dominance, credited with the overwhelming majority of aerial victories in the Pacific. Its legacy was not written in headlines, but in the quiet relief of crews who watched their bombers come back alive, and in the pride of a nation that learned resilience beats perfection. This is the story of the Hellcat, how an unassuming cat from hell rose to master the skies of the Pacific. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see why veterans called it their guardian angel. Do you think the Hellcat was the greatest aircraft of World War II? Hit like and share your When the Pacific War erupted, the United States Navy found itself in a terrifying predicament. The Japanese Zero, light, fast, and almost untouchable in the hands of its skilled pilots, dominated the skies. Again and again, American aviators climbed into their outdated F4F Wildcats and fought with courage, only to discover that bravery alone was not enough. Losses mounted, and the gap in air superiority grew more dangerous with each passing month. For the sailors aboard carriers and the soldiers on far-flung islands, the Zero was not just an airplane, it was a shadow looming over every operation. It was in this climate of fear and urgency that the call went out for something new. The Navy could not wait years for a revolutionary design. They needed a fighter that could be built quickly, survive the rigors of carrier warfare, and give young, often inexperienced pilots a real chance against the enemy. The responsibility fell to Grumman, a company already trusted for building rugged naval aircraft. They were told, in essence, we need a miracle, and we need it now. Grumman's engineers did not reinvent the wheel. Instead, they took the Wildcat as their foundation and scaled it up, reshaping its lines into something larger, stronger, and more forgiving in the hands of a rookie. At the heart of this new machine would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a powerhouse capable of delivering the ED speed and climb rate to finally meet the Zero head-on. But the design was about more than numbers. The cockpit was made spacious and well-protected, with armor plating and bullet-resistant glass, small mercies that meant a pilot might live to fly another day. The wings were wide and stable for carrier landings. The frame could absorb punishment and still return home. It was a fighter designed not for perfection on paper, but for survival in the harsh reality of war. By mid-1942, as America struggled to recover from Pearl Harbor and the desperate battles of Coral Sea and Midway, the prototype that would become the F6F Hellcat took shape. It was born not in comfort, but in crisis. And though no one yet knew just how decisive it would prove, those who watched it roll off the production lines could sense that a new chapter was about to begin. From the ashes of defeat, the cat from hell was preparing to leap. The Hellcat was never meant to impress with sleek lines or glamorous speed records. It was meant to fight, and more importantly, to bring its pilot home. At its core roared the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the same powerhouse that gave the Corsair and the Thunderbolt their bite. With nearly 2,000 horsepower, this engine pushed the Hellcat to speeds of around 380 miles per hour, enough to finally stand toe-to-toe with the once untouchable Zero. It could climb fast, dive hard, and still keep its stability, qualities that made all the difference in the chaos of a dogfight. Yet the Hellcat's genius was not in raw performance alone. It was in how forgiving it was to the young men who flew it. Thousands of American boys, some barely out of high school, stepped onto carrier decks with only a handful of flying hours. They needed a machine that wouldn't punish inexperience, but would instead protect them. The Hellcat's wide wings made takeoffs and landings smoother, even on the narrow pitching decks of Pacific carriers. Its tough frame could absorb bullets and shrapnel, allowing pilots to limp back to base when other planes might have gone down in flames. The cockpit itself was a small fortress. Armored plates and bulletproof glass gave the man inside a fighting chance, even when enemy tracers ripped across the sky. For a generation of young aviators, the Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was a trusted companion. Veterans would later say, "If you had to go into battle, this was the plane you wanted under you." And when it came to firepower, the Hellcat delivered with devastating authority. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns lined its wings, capable of shredding both nimble fighters and hardened bombers. Later versions carried rockets and bombs, making the Hellcat just as deadly against ground targets as it was in the air. It was versatile, reliable, and relentless, the very qualities needed in a war that demanded endurance as much as brilliance. Built not for show, but for survival, the Hellcat became the soldier's plane. It was a machine designed with the everyday pilot in mind, giving him the strength and security to fight back against the odds. And soon, those odds would tilt sharply in America's favor. From the very beginning, the Hellcat's destiny was tied to one enemy, the Mitsubishi A6M0. For years, the Zero had ruled the skies of the Pacific. It was light, agile, and in the hands of skilled Japanese pilots, almost untouchable. At Pearl Harbor, over the Coral Sea, and in the early island battles, American aviators quickly learned to fear its lightning maneuvers and deadly guns. The Zero became more than an airplane. It was the symbol of Japan's early dominance, a machine that seemed to defy the laws of combat. But by the summer of 1943, the tide was shifting. The Hellcat entered the fight not as a perfect plane on paper, but as a fighter built for the reality of war. It was heavier than the Zero, but that weight carried armor and firepower. It wasn't as nimble at slow speeds, but once the Hellcat gained altitude and used its power, the balance tilted. American pilots were taught a simple rule: never turn with a Zero. Instead, dive, climb, and strike with the advantages the Hellcat offered, and when they did, the results were devastating. Statistics tell the story better than words. In its service, the Hellcat racked up over 5,000 enemy kills, more than any other Navy fighter. Against the Zero, it achieved an almost unbelievable kill ratio of 19-1. That meant for every American lost, 19 Japanese fighters went down. To young pilots, many of them fighting their first real battles in the Pacific, the Hellcat was no longer just a machine. It was a shield against the legend of the Zero, and it gave them the confidence to take the fight straight into enemy skies. For the Japanese, the arrival of the Hellcat was a shock they never fully recovered from. The Zero had been designed for lightning offense, but it was fragile, with no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Against Wildcats, that trade-off had seemed acceptable. Against Hellcats, it was suicide. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted, and the once proud symbol of Japan's air supremacy began to fall from the sky in burning fragments. The clash between Hellcat and Zero was not just a contest of machines. It was a turning point in the human struggle for survival across the Pacific. One represented the pride of an empire, the other, the resilience of a nation rising from early defeats. And as the months passed, it became clear. The cat from hell had claimed the sky, and the days of the Zero were numbered. The stage for the Hellcat's true legend was not in test flights or training manuals, but in the vast blue battleground of the Pacific. After proving it could stand against the Zero, the question was no longer whether the Hellcat could fight. It was how far it could carry the war across island after island until Japan's empire itself was within reach. From Tarawa to Saipan, from the Philippines to the very doorstep of Japan, the Hellcat became the point of the spear. At Tarawa in late 1943, the United States launched one of its first bloody assaults on a Japanese-held atoll. The battle was savage, the beaches soaked with American lives, but overhead, Hellcats carved out the air superiority that made the invasion possible. They struck Japanese positions, strafed enemy strongholds, and cleared the skies of opposition. For the Marines fighting yard by yard on the sand, every pass of a Hellcat was a reminder that they were not alone, that somewhere above, young men in cockpits were fighting just as fiercely to keep them alive. As the island-hopping campaign pressed deeper into the Pacific, the Hellcat's role only grew. At Saipan in the summer of 1944, Hellcats flew endless sorties, escorting bombers, supporting amphibious landings, and dueling enemy fighters. It was here, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that the Hellcat cemented its reputation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft poured toward the American fleet, determined to halt the advance. But the Hellcats were waiting. With disciplined tactics and overwhelming firepower, they tore through the enemy formations. By the end of the day, more than 300 Japanese planes were gone, shattered in the largest carrier battle in history. Pilots would later recall the surreal scene, Japanese planes falling so fast that the sky itself seemed littered with wreckage. For the Americans, it was more than just a tactical victory. It was the moment the balance of the Pacific Air War tilted decisively. The myth of Japanese air invincibility was shattered, and the Hellcat was the hammer that broke it. Many young pilots returned from that battle with kill marks on their fuselages, stunned at what they had accomplished. Some had gone into combat for the first time that very morning, and by dusk, they were aces. The advance pressed onward, and the Philippines became the next great proving ground. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Hellcats once again led the charge. They flew escort for carriers, intercepted kamikazes before they could slam into American decks, and strafed Japanese ships and airfields with relentless fury. For sailors watching from the decks below, the Hellcats were their shield against fire from the sky. Without them, the cost of retaking the Philippines would have been far higher. Everywhere the Hellcat went, it carried with it the same message. The United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was now on the offensive. Each island taken, each fleet battle won, pushed the front line closer to Japan itself. And above it all, the Hellcat remained constant, the Navy's dependable workhorse, lifting young Americans into the sky and returning them again and again to fight another day. By the time the Philippines were secured, the Hellcat was no longer just a fighter. It was the embodiment of American momentum, the living proof that perseverance and resilience could turn despair into dominance. The Zero had once ruled the skies, but in the Pacific crucible, the Hellcat had claimed them for good. The Hellcat's legacy was not confined to the decks of American carriers alone. Its reputation for rugged reliability and lethal effectiveness quickly spread beyond U.S. forces, and soon the fighter was in the hands of America's closest allies. For Britain's Fleet Air Arm, which had struggled early in the war with outdated carrier aircraft, the arrival of the Hellcat was a revelation. British pilots flew them in operations across Asia and the Pacific, from strikes against Japanese oil facilities in Sumatra to patrols over the Indian Ocean. They praised the same qualities American aviators cherished, the power, the durability, and the forgiving nature that allowed even less experienced pilots to hold their own in combat. After the war, Hellcats found their way into the service of other nations as well. France used them in its post-war campaigns, and other air forces across the world relied on the Hellcat as a dependable frontline fighter during the turbulent years that followed. For many smaller nations, the Hellcat symbolized more than just American industry. It represented a lifeline, a proven tool to defend their skies at a time when new conflicts loomed. What made the Hellcat's global story remarkable was how consistently it delivered. Whether flying under the Stars and Stripes, the Union Jack, or the tricolor of France, it earned the respect of those who flew it. This shared reliance created a bond across nations, proof that in the darkest days of the war, one fighter had risen above all others to safeguard not just one country's freedom, but the hopes of many. From the beaches of Tarawa to the airstrips of Britain's far-flung empire, the Hellcat became more than an American weapon. It became a global symbol of resilience, a reminder that in times of crisis, strength and trustworthiness matter most. Behind every Hellcat victory was a young man strapped into its cockpit, often with little more than courage and a few dozen hours of flying time. What made the Hellcat extraordinary was not just its engineering, but the way it transformed rookies into survivors and sometimes into legends. Many pilots who climbed aboard had never faced the terror of a dogfight. They were barely out of training when they were sent to the decks of carriers, their futures uncertain, their hands trembling on the controls. The Hellcat gave them something invaluable: confidence. Its stability and toughness forgave mistakes, allowing a green pilot to learn in the crucible of combat rather than perish in it. That safety net turned nervous novices into steady warriors. Out of this crucible rose aces whose names still echo in history. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, scored 34 victories, including an astonishing day when he downed 9 Japanese aircraft before running out of ammunition. He was not alone. Dozens of Hellcat pilots reached ace status, many after only a handful of missions. Their stories reveal not only skill, but the faith they placed in their machine. They knew that if they flew smart, the Hellcat would give them the edge they needed to survive and to win. For the men on the carriers, the sight of Hellcats returning after a mission, some scarred, riddled with holes but still flying, was a source of hope. Each safe landing meant another son, another brother, another friend was coming home. The bond between pilot and plane was almost human, built on trust forged under fire. The Hellcat was more than an aircraft. It was a mentor, a protector, and for many, the difference between life and death. From rookies trembling on their first mission to seasoned aces leading squadrons into battle, the cat from hell stood by them all. It turned fear into courage, and in doing so, helped shape not only the outcome of the Pacific War, but the lives of an entire generation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Hellcat had already etched its name into history. More than 12,000 were built, and together they were credited with destroying the majority of Japanese aircraft lost to American Navy fighters. Yet its legacy was never about numbers alone. It was about the lives saved, the missions made possible, and the quiet reassurance it gave to every pilot who climbed into its cockpit. The Hellcat was not a glamorous machine. It did not inspire poetry or legends the way some fighters did, but it earned something more enduring: trust. For the sailors on carriers, for the Marines storming beaches, and for the young aviators who depended on it to survive their first taste of combat, the Hellcat became a symbol of reliability in a world of chaos. Its story reminds us that greatness is not always about being the fastest or the most beautiful. Sometimes it lies in being strong enough, dependable enough, and resilient enough to carry ordinary people through extraordinary times. The Hellcat was built for war, but it carried within it the hopes of a nation and the determination of those who refused to surrender. Today, when we look back at the Pacific War, the Hellcat stands as proof that resilience can triumph over fear. It was the faithful guardian of its pilots and the steel backbone of victory at sea. Its roar still echoes not just in history books, but in the memories of those who lived because of it. If you found this video helped you understand the Hellcat better, make sure to hit like, share it with your friends, and leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more fascinating World War II stories.